The mansion was silent, in the particular way that meant everyone inside it was afraid to make a sound. Eli didn't know that. He couldn't hear it, couldn't see the guards positioned at every door, couldn't sense the tension coiled through a house built entirely around one man's need for control. All he knew was marble under his cane, and a shape on the table that felt worth exploring. He had no way of knowing it would cost him everything, or save it. Rain hadn't touched Manhattan in 11 days, and the August heat pressed down on the city like something with weight. For Clara Bennett, heat was just another obstacle between one job and the next. A detail she'd stopped noticing years ago, the way she'd stopped noticing most things that didn't directly threaten her son. At 35, Clara had learned that survival rarely looked like the version people imagined. It looked like 6 a.m. bus routes, like memorizing which employer's kitchen had a spare key hidden under the third flower pot, like never once, in 4 years, being late. She was tired in a way that didn't show up in a mirror. Hazel eyes that still softened whenever she looked at Eli. Dark hair, always knotted back before her first shift. A body that carried exhaustion in her shoulders and never let it reach her voice. Once, she had been an occupational therapist working with children, a career she left behind the year her husband died, and her son survived the crash that took his sight and most of his hearing with it. She had made him a promise in a hospital corridor that still visited her in dream. I will build you a world you can still touch, even if you can't see it. 4 years later, that promise looked like a one-bedroom apartment in Queens, a job cleaning the homes of people who never learned her last name, and a boy who had turned darkness and silence into a fluency all his own. Eli was 8. He navigated by memory, texture, vibration, and scent, could identify a room by the particular hush of its air conditioning, could find his mother across a house by the rhythm of her footsteps alone. Where strangers saw a child who had lost everything, Clara saw a boy who had rebuilt an entire language out of the wreckage, one she had learned to read as fluently as any spoken word. He knew which mug was hers by the chip in its handle. He knew the flowers on their kitchen windowsill by scent alone, and could tell her, without fail, which ones needed water. That morning, Eli's usual sitter had called in sick. Clara had no backup, no cushion of savings, no second option. So she did the only thing a mother in her position could do. Tucked his hand into hers, promised him he'd stay close, and brought him along to the largest, most heavily guarded house on her route. She had no way of knowing that the man who owned it had spent a decade making sure no one who wasn't supposed to survive it did. Vincent Moreau was 42, and the stillness in him unsettled people more than volume ever could have. He wore his authority the way other men wore cologne, quietly, completely, impossible to ignore once you noticed it. Dark hair slicked back, a neck marked with old ink he never explained, eyes that had watched too much to be surprised by anything anymore. He never raised his voice. The men who worked for him understood. That was precisely why they feared him more than the ones who did. For 18 years, everything Moreau controlled, every account, every alliance, every buried favor and hidden name, had lived in one place. A single encrypted phone that never left arm's reach, that he trusted no one, not even his own blood, to touch. He'd built a career on the belief that empires didn't fall to armies. They fell to carelessness. A door left unlocked, a password written down, a moment of trust extended to the wrong person. He had never extended that trust to anyone. That morning, he sat in his study reviewing a shipment manifest, half listening to the muffled sounds of the house around him, a maid vacuuming somewhere upstairs, a car pulling into the far end of the drive. Ordinary sounds, the sounds of a house that ran the way he needed it to run, quietly, predictably, under his hand. He didn't know a boy was in his foyer. He didn't know. The boy couldn't see. The security cameras couldn't hear the low murmur of his guards near the entrance. Had no way of understanding that the calm of this house was a performance built over a foundation of violence. All Eli knew was the shape of the room beneath his cane, cool marble beneath thin-soled shoes, the particular echo of a ceiling much higher than any room he'd known. He kept his free hand trailing along the edge of a column, the way his mother had taught him. Count your steps, remember your path, you can always find your way back. His mother was 2 floors above him now, wiping down a windowsill, glancing at the baby monitor she'd propped nearby out of habit, even though he'd never once needed it before. Ely's cane found the leg of a low, ornate table. He paused, curious. His fingers climbed the table's edge, found its surface, and touched something rectangular and warm. Warm the way things are when they've recently been held. He didn't know it was a phone. He didn't know it was the only key to an empire built on blood, silence, and 40 years of buried secrets. His cane brushed against it. It slid, teetered at the table's edge for half a second. A half second that, had anyone been watching, could have been stopped with a single hand. No one was watching. It fell. The sound of the screen shattering against marble tore through the mansion like a gunshot. It echoed up the staircase down the hall into the study where Vincent Moreau's head snapped up from the manifest in his hands. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Then, all at once, they did. More than a dozen men reaching for their weapons in perfect, practiced unison, closing in on the sound from every direction of the house. Because that phone belonged to Vincent Moreau, and it had just been destroyed by an 8-year-old boy who could neither see the guns being drawn nor hear the silence that had followed. Comment Eli if you think Vincent shows mercy. Comment Mercerai if you think this ends in bloodshed. The sound of running feet reached Clara before she understood why. She dropped her cloth into the bucket and was already moving before the second guard's shout echoed up the stairwell, some animal instinct in her chest recognizing danger, before her mind caught up to it. By the time she reached the top of the staircase and saw the foyer below, her whole body went cold. Eli was on the floor, surrounded. 6 men in dark suits had formed a loose circle around him, hands inside their jackets, eyes hard and fixed on a boy who sat perfectly still amid a scatter of black glass, his cane resting across his knees, his face turned toward sounds he couldn't place and shapes he couldn't see. Eli! Clara took the stairs 2 at a time, her shoes slipping against marble, and threw herself between her son and the nearest weapon before anyone could stop her. Don't you touch him. Her voice cracked on the last word, but she didn't move, didn't flinch, dropping to her knees and pulling Eli against her chest with both arms locked around him. He didn't know. He can't see, he can't hear, he didn't know what that was. Please, please, he's just a little boy. One of the guards took a step closer, weapon still raised. Mom, step back. No. Clara's whole body shook, but her voice held. You'll have to go through me. Eli, sensing the tremor running through his mother's arms, reached up and found her jaw with his small fingers, the way he always did when the world grew too loud for him to understand. What's wrong? His hand asked in a private language only the 2 of them shared. What happened? She couldn't answer him. She could barely breathe. Everyone stand down. The voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Every gun in the room lowered at once, the way iron filings arranged themselves around a magnet, and the guards parted to let Vincent Moreau walk through them. He moved without hurry, dress shoes silent against the marble, and crouched down beside the wreckage of his phone with the unbothered calm of a man inspecting a spilled drink rather than the collapse of his life's work. He picked up the largest fragment, a corner of the screen, still faintly warm, and turned it over once in his fingers. Clara's breath caught. She pulled Eli tighter against her, bracing for whatever came next. Vincent didn't look at her. He looked at the boy. Does he know what he's done? The question landed in the silent foyer like a stone dropped into still water. Nobody answered. The guards exchanged glances. Clara opened her mouth, some fractured apology already forming, but no sound came out. Vincent rose slowly to his feet, still holding the fragment, and studied Eli with an expression none of his men had ever seen on him before. Not rage, not the cold, contained fury they braced for daily. Something closer to calculation, something closer to disbelief. He's blind, Clara finally managed, her voice raw. And deaf. He was only exploring. He touches things, that's how he sees the world. I swear to you he meant no harm, please. I'll pay for it. I'll work every day for the rest of my life if I have to. Just don't stop. Vincent said it quietly, and she stopped, her whole body trembling around her son. He looked down at the fragment in his palm for a long moment. One of the senior guards, a broad-shouldered man named Reyes who had been with Vincent for 11 years, shifted uncomfortably. Sir, we can pull thee. There are no backups, Reyes. Vincent's voice stayed level, but something underneath it had gone very still, the way the air goes still before a storm breaks. I remember the conversation. 18 months ago, I wanted a mirrored drive, encrypted, off-site, untouchable. His eyes lifted from the shattered glass to the room around him, moving from face to face with a patience that made every man present want to look at his own shoes. Someone told me it was a liability. Someone told me a second copy was a second way to be robbed. The silence in the foyer deepened into something with weight, because everyone in that room understood, in the same slow-dawning horror, exactly what had just been destroyed. That phone hadn't been a phone. It had been the only door into everything Vincent Moreau had spent 2 decades building. The ledger tracking every dollar moved through 4 shell corporations and a dozen offshore accounts, the names of 11 judges, 3 senators, and a police commissioner who owed him more than money, the location of 6 safe houses scattered across 3 states, the identities of the men he kept on retainer for the jobs no one else could be trusted with, and years of recordings, documents and leverage that had kept every rival family in the city too afraid to move against him. All of it, encrypted behind a single passcode, on a single device with no copy anywhere in the world. Gone, in under 2 seconds, beneath the cane of a boy who would never even know what he'd touched. Clara felt Eli's fingers tighten in her sleeve, sensing the fear radiating off her body. Even if he couldn't understand its source, she pressed her lips to the top of his head, murmuring against his hair without thinking, without knowing if it would matter at all. I'm here, baby. I'm not leaving you. Vincent watched them for a long moment. The mother curled protectively over her son, the boy searching blindly for reassurance he couldn't see coming, and something shifted behind his eyes that none of his men could read. Clear the room, he said finally. Reyes hesitated. Sir? I said clear the room. His voice hadn't risen, but the command in it left no space for argument. One by one, the guards lowered their weapons fully and filed toward the hallway, casting uncertain glances back at the boy still sitting amid the wreckage of an empire. When the last of them had gone, Vincent stood alone with Clara and Eli in the vast echoing foyer, the shattered phone still resting in his palm. He wasn't thinking about killing the child anymore. He was thinking about a conversation 18 months old, a quiet suggestion, delivered by someone he trusted, that had left him with exactly 1 point of failure in an empire built to have none. Someone had wanted this. Someone had engineered the exact conditions that made this single accidental moment catastrophic, which meant the real danger in his house wasn't kneeling on the floor in front of him. It was still walking his halls, wearing his trust like a second skin. Vincent closed his fist around the broken glass and turned toward the staircase, his voice carrying through the silent mansion with absolute, unshakable finality. Nobody leaves this house. Not until I know who did this. The room they were given was on the 3rd floor, tucked at the end of a hallway lined with paintings Clara didn't recognize and didn't dare ask about. It was larger than their entire apartment in Queens. A canopy bed, a private bathroom, a window overlooking gardens she'd only ever seen from behind a vacuum cleaner. It should have felt like luxury. It felt like a cage with good lighting. 2 guards stood outside their door round the clock. Clara had tried, twice, to walk past them toward the stairs, and both times had been met with the same polite, immovable wall of silence. Nobody had told her outright that she was a prisoner. Nobody had needed to. How long? She'd asked one of them the second night. Until he lets us go. The guard hadn't answered. His eyes had flicked toward the hallway camera instead, as if even the question needed permission. Ellie, for his part, adjusted the way he always did, by mapping the room with his hands and his cane until its shape lived inside him as clearly as their apartment ever had. Within a day, he could cross it without hesitation, could find the edge of the bed, the door, the window seat, all from memory. What frightened Clara terrified him far less. His world had never depended on knowing where he was safe. It depended only on knowing where things were. What surprised her was Vincent. He began appearing in small, unannounced moments, never with the guards, never with the cold formality of their first encounter. He'd pause in doorways, watch from a distance. On the 3rd morning, Clara found him standing at the end of the hallway as Eli made his way toward breakfast, cane sweeping in its familiar rhythm, and watched the boy stop dead in his tracks 3 feet from a housekeeper turn unerringly toward her and say her name, Marta. The housekeeper laughed, startled. How did you? Your shoes, Eli said simply. Left one squeaks. Vincent said nothing. But Clara, watching from the stairwell, saw something flicker across his face that hadn't been there in the foyer 2 days earlier, something almost like wonder. It happened again that afternoon. A guard dropped his keys near the east wing entrance, cursed under his breath, and began patting his pockets in confusion. Ellie, sitting nearby with his hands folded in his lap, tilted his head toward the sound of metal striking marble and pointed, without being asked, to a spot 4 feet from where the guard was searching. There, the keys were exactly where he said. By the 4th day, Vincent had started finding reasons to be in the same rooms as the boy. He told himself it was strategic, understanding the one variable that had shattered 18 months of careful engineering. But strategy didn't explain why on the 5th evening, he pulled a chair to the study window and simply watched Eli trace the spines of the books on the lowest shelf, murmuring their titles to himself in Braille beneath his fingers for the better part of an hour. "He reads faster than most of my lawyers," Vincent said once, almost to himself. Clara, standing in a doorway with a tray she'd been told not to carry but insisted on carrying anyway, allowed herself the smallest smile. He always has. Books were the first thing he ever fought me on, wanted to do them himself. Vincent glanced at her, stubborn, like his father. Something passed behind his eyes at that. Brief, unreadable, and he looked away first. It was in those quiet hours that Clara began to see the parts of Vincent Moreau that his reputation had never accounted for. He read every night, alone in a study lined floor to ceiling with worn hardcovers that looked read rather than displayed. Classical music drifted from behind his closed door some evenings. Chopin, once, that she recognized from her own mother's records. Once passing his study when the door had been left ajar, she saw him holding a small faded photograph. A young woman, maybe 16, laughing at something outside the frame, before he noticed her shadow and closed the drawer without a word. She never asked who the girl was. Something in the set of his jaw told her the answer would cost him more than the question was worth. It was Marco who broke the fragile quiet on the 6th day. Clara didn't know him well. One of Vincent's senior captains, a broad man with a shaved head and leather gloves he wore even indoors, who moved through the mansion with the easy authority of someone who answered to no one but Vincent himself. He'd come to deliver a report, striding into the sitting room, where Eli sat playing with a set of wooden blocks Marta had found for him. The moment Marco's footsteps crossed the threshold, Eli went rigid. He dropped the block in his hand. His head turned sharply toward the sound, and his small body began to tremble in a way Clara had never seen before. Not fear of the unknown, but something closer to recognition. He rose to his feet, cane forgotten, and took 2 uncertain steps toward Marco, reaching out with both hands. "Ellie." Clara moved to pull him back, alarmed. "Baby, come here." But Eli pressed forward, insistent, until his fingers found the leather of Marco's glove. He went still. His breathing turned quick and shallow, distress rippling visibly across his face, and he reached for the glove again and again, patting it with growing agitation, as if trying to confirm something he desperately didn't want to be true. Marco froze. "What is he doing?" "I don't know," Clara said, pulling Eli firmly back against her chest despite his resistance. "He's never done this. He doesn't touch strangers like this." Vincent, who had entered behind Marco without either of them noticing, said nothing, but his eyes had narrowed on the gloves and on the boy's frantic, unmistakable reaction to them, with a stillness that made the temperature of the room seem to drop. He remembered, suddenly and with total clarity, where he had seen those gloves before. Marco had been in the foyer that morning, standing near the table, close enough to have set the phone down himself, hours before it fell. Vincent said nothing to Marco. He simply watched him leave the room, tracked his footsteps down the hall with the same predatory patience he'd once used to track men who owed him money and never paid. And when the door finally closed, he turned to Clara with a voice gone very quiet. "Your son remembers things most grown men would forget in a heartbeat." Clara held Eli tighter, still shaking. "What did he just tell you?" Vincent's eyes stayed on the closed door. "That I'd been asking the wrong question," he said. "I've been looking for who broke my phone." He turned finally, and his expression had hardened into something Clara hadn't seen since the foyer, the version of him the rest of the world feared. "I should have been asking who wanted it broken." The first phone call came at 2 a.m. Vincent was still awake. He rarely slept more than 4 hours a night when Reyes burst into his study without knocking. A breach of protocol so unprecedented that Vincent was on his feet before Reyes had finished crossing the threshold. "The Petrovs hit the Bronx safe house an hour ago," Reyes said, breathless. "It's gone. Burned to the frame. 2 men dead." Vincent's jaw tightened. That location wasn't on any digital record. It only existed on the phone. "I know." Reyes swallowed. "Sir, it's not just the Bronx. The Jersey account, the one that runs through Holloway's firm, it's frozen. Someone tipped off the feds this morning, gave them just enough to trigger a review. And Councilman Reyes, no relation, sir. Sorry, he's not answering calls. Neither is Judge Ferris. Or Commissioner Wade. Vanished. Vanished. Vanished." Vincent set down the glass in his hand with deliberate, controlled care, the kind of stillness that unsettled Reyes far more than shouting would have. "That's not possible from a single shattered phone. Even fully compromised, cracking that encryption would take a specialist team weeks. This is happening in hours. Which means someone already had access." Vincent's eyes lifted, cold and sharp. "The phone didn't start this collapse, Reyes. It only gave someone the cover to accelerate what they'd already been planning. By morning, the bleeding had spread further than either of them could contain. 3 more safe houses reported break-in, a shipping account in the Cayman, one Vincent had personally set up 11 years ago, showed a balance of 0. Soldiers who had sworn loyalty for a decade stopped answering calls, their allegiances shifting overnight to families who smelled blood in the water. The Moreau Empire, built over 20 years on the principle that nothing could touch what no one could find, was being dismantled piece by someone who already knew exactly where to look. Clara felt the change in the house before anyone told her what was happening. The guards outside her door doubled. Marta stopped making eye contact when she brought meals, her hands trembling as she set the tray down, and Vincent, the version of him she'd started, cautiously, to almost understand, had vanished entirely, replaced by a man moving through the mansion with a coiled, dangerous urgency she hadn't seen since the night they'd arrived. "What's happening?" she asked him directly, catching him in the hallway outside the study. "Rival families believe I'm vulnerable," Vincent said, not slowing his pace. "They're not wrong. And Eli?" Vincent stopped then, turned to face her fully. "There's a theory circulating that your son somehow retained information from that phone, passcodes, account numbers, that he's not just a witness, that he's a walking vault." Clara's stomach dropped. "That's insane. He can't see a screen, he can't hear a spoken code." "I know that. You know that." Vincent's eyes were hard. "The men coming for him don't care. The attack came just after midnight. It began with the perimeter lights failing. Not a power outage, Vincent knew instantly, but a deliberate cut. Someone with inside knowledge of the mansion's security grid. Then gunfire, distant at first near the east gate, then closer, then everywhere at once. "Clara!" Vincent's voice cut through the chaos in the third-floor hallway as he came around the corner at a dead run, weapon already drawn. "Get him now." We moved to the panic room. Clara had Eli in her arms before Vincent finished the sentence. The boy rigid with confusion, unable to hear the gunfire, but feeling the tremor of it through the floor beneath his feet. His hands gripping his mother's collar in silent, desperate panic. They made it 3 steps down the hallway before 2 men in black tactical gear rounded the corner ahead of them, weapons raised. Vincent moved before Clara could scream. He put himself bodily between the gunman and the mother and child behind him, firing twice in the space of a single breath, and both men dropped before either had gotten off a shot. He didn't pause to look at them. He grabbed Clara's arm and hauled her forward. Eli crashed protectively between them. Stairs. Now, the mansion had become a war zone in the space of 10 minutes. Muzzle flashes lighting the hallways in strobing bursts, Vincent's remaining loyal men fighting a desperate, chaotic retreat toward the interior of the house while unfamiliar shooters pushed in from at least 2 breach points. Vincent moved through it with brutal, practiced efficiency, clearing a path 1 room at a time, always angling his own body between his family. Not his family, he corrected himself, even as the thought had already formed, and the line of fire. A bullet tore through the wall inches from Eli's head. Clara screamed and threw herself over her son, and Vincent spun, fired twice more, and the shooter in the stairwell folded backward without a sound. "Go, go!" He shoved them both through the panic room door, a reinforced steel vault disguised behind a bookshelf in the East Wing library. and slammed it shut behind the three of them, just as another round of gunfire chewed through the wall outside. In the sudden ringing silence, Clara sat on the floor with Eli shaking in her arms and looked up at Vincent, breathing hard blood on his sleeve that wasn't his own, gun still in his hand, with an expression she couldn't fully name. "You could have left us out there," she said quietly. "Let them take him. Solved your own problem." Vincent lowered himself against the opposite wall, exhaling slowly, and for a long moment didn't answer. "I've spent my whole life protecting things that didn't deserve it," he said finally. "Money, secrets, men who'd sell me out the second it benefited them." His eyes lifted to Eli, still trembling but calming now under his mother's hand, unaware of how close death had just come and gone. "He's the first thing in this house that's ever been innocent." By dawn, the attackers had been driven back, the mansion's perimeter secured, the dead counted and the wounded treated. Vincent stood in the ruined foyer as the sun rose through shattered windows, surveying the wreckage of a night that should never have reached his walls, and felt for the first time in years something colder than fear settle into his chest. Because only someone inside his own organization could have cut the perimeter lights. Only someone inside could have known exactly which hallway led to the panic room and timed the breach around it. He turned to Reyes, voice flat and final. "Get me a head count. Everyone, every captain, every soldier, accounted for by name." 20 minutes later, Reyes returned, his face pale. "Sir, Marco's gone. His room's untouched. His car's still in the garage." He hesitated. "He's not answering, and nobody saw him leave." Vincent said nothing for a long moment, staring out at the wreckage of his own home. "Find him," he said quietly, "before he finds them first." The van smelled like motor oil and cigarette smoke, and Clara counted the turns out of habit, left-right, a long straightaway, some useless instinct telling her that direction still mattered even now, even with her wrists bound and Eli pressed trembling against her side. They had come for them just after sunrise, while the mansion was still stitching itself back together from the night before. Two men in the service uniforms of a catering company Vincent's estate had used before. An oversight no one had thought to question, not with everything else in flames. By the time anyone realized the delivery van hadn't left, Clara and Eli were already gone. Marco sat across from them now, gloves still on, his broad frame filling the narrow space of the van's interior with a stillness that felt more dangerous than the guns Clara had grown almost used to. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice low, careful not to let Eli feel the tremor in it. "Whatever Vincent did to you, Vincent didn't do anything to me." Marco's voice was flat, almost bored. "That's the problem. 12 years I served that family, watched him build something out of nothing, watched him become untouchable, and every year I watched him forget the men who made it possible." He studied Eli, who sat rigid and silent, fingers laced tightly through his mother's. "I didn't come for revenge, Mrs. Bennett. I came to finish what your son already started." The van stopped an hour later at a warehouse somewhere Clara didn't recognize. The air inside, thick with dust and the smell of rust. Marco pulled Eli gently but firmly from Clara's arms. She screamed, fought was restrained by a second man before she could reach him, and set the boy down in the center of an empty room alone, his cane placed deliberately just out of reach. "He's not going to hurt you," Marco said to Clara, his tone almost gentle, which frightened her more than cruelty would have. "I just need him to remember something." "Remember what?" "He's blind. He doesn't know what a passcode looks like. He doesn't need to know what it looks like." Marco crouched to Eli's height, speaking slowly even though he knew the boy couldn't hear him. "He needs to remember what he touched." What followed was not violence. It was worse in its own quiet way. Hours of patient, methodical, psychological pressure, Marco guiding Eli's hands over object after object, forcing him to retrace piece by piece every surface he had touched in the Moreau foyer that morning. The marble column, the edge of the low table, the fragments of the phone itself, sealed now in a plastic bag, pressed briefly into Eli's palm until the boy flinched and pulled away. Distressed by the memory his fingers carried in it, Clara watched, helpless, bound to a chair in the corner, unable to explain to her son what was happening or why, able only to speak to him the only way that mattered, pressing her palm flat against the floor when Marco allowed it, tracing reassurance into his skin whenever their hands could reach. I'm here. You're safe." Eli didn't understand the danger. He understood only that the world had become confusing and loud in ways he couldn't name, and that his hands, which had never once betrayed him, were being asked questions he didn't know how to answer. "There's nothing else," Marco said finally, frustration edging into his voice as the hours dragged on. No password, no memory, just a boy who broke a phone. He was turning away done when Eli, exhausted, disoriented, seeking the only comfort his body knew how to give itself, reached out and pressed his palm flat against the floor of the warehouse, tracing the same restless pattern his fingers had traced 100 times before. Table edge, table leg, the underside. Where his fingers had once found a groove he'd been too rushed to explore that morning in the Moreau foyer. He murmured, more to himself than to anyone in the room. "Under." Marco went still. What did he say? Clara's breath caught. He touched something under the table. That morning, before it fell. I remember he reached beneath it for a second. I thought he was just steadying himself. Marco was already moving, radio in hand, barking coordinates at the men still stationed at the mansion. It took them 40 minutes to search the foyer. 40 minutes in which Clara held her breath and prayed she was wrong. Prayed there was nothing there. Prayed this would end with nothing found and no reason left for Marco to keep them. Then the radio crackled. "We found something." "Debababed," recessed into the underside of the table. It's small, encrypted, looks like a backup drive. Chips the size of a fingernail. Marco's face, for the first time since Clara had known him, showed something close to shock. He forgot, he said slowly, almost to himself. He actually forgot it existed. A short, humorless laugh escaped him. 18 months ago, before I convinced him a mirrored backup was a liability, he'd already built one, hidden it himself, and forgot. "Then it's over," Clara said, desperate, straining against her restraints. "He has a backup. The Empire isn't gone. Please, just let us go. There's no reason to." "There's every reason." Marco's voice hardened, all the earlier calculation draining into something raw, something that had clearly been waiting years to surface. "You think I did this for money? For power?" He crouched in front of her, his composure cracking at last. "I did this because I watched that man build an empire on the backs of people he threw away the second they stopped being useful. My brother was one of them. 15 years of loyalty. And Vincent had him killed over a rumor that turned out to be nothing." His jaw tightened. "I've spent 3 years planning this, waiting for the right crack to widen. And then your son handed me one on a silver platter. So what now?" Clara's voice broke. "You have the chip. You have us. What more do you want?" Marco stood, straightening his gloves, his expression settling back into the cold stillness she'd seen from the beginning. "I want the only thing that's ever mattered." He nodded to the men behind him, already reaching for the door. "Vincent Moreau doesn't get to walk away from this and keep pretending he's changed. Not for a maid. Not for her blind son. Not for anyone." He looked back once at Eli, still trembling, still reaching blindly for his mother's hand, with something that might, for half a second, have been regret. Then it was gone. "Bring the girl and the boy," he said. "We're going back to the mansion." "And Vincent?" Marco's answer was quiet, final, and absolute. "Kill him the moment he walks through the door." Vincent felt the mansion change before he heard the first shot. He'd spent the last 2 hours tearing the city apart looking for Marco, calling in favors he'd sworn never to use again. When Reyes's voice cracked through the radio at his hip, "Sir, they're coming back." Marco's convoy, 3 vehicles, headed straight for the front gate. He's got them. He's got Clara and the boy. Vincent was already moving, already pulling his weapon, already feeling something in his chest he hadn't allowed himself in 20 years. Pure, unfiltered fear, and not for himself. "Lock down the gate. Nobody fires until I know exactly where they are inside the house." It didn't matter. Marco's men breached the perimeter within minutes, and what followed wasn't an attack so much as a detonation. Gunfire erupting from 3 directions at once, half of it from men Vincent had trusted for a decade, their loyalty bought or broken sometime in the last 72 hours without his ever knowing. The east wing window shattered under automatic fire. A charge went off near the garage, the concussion rattling through the foundation, orange light flaring against the pale stone of the mansion's face. Vincent moved through his own home like a man walking through a nightmare built from memory. Every hallway he knew, every doorway he designed for exactly this outcome, now filled with smoke and the bodies of men who'd once called him family. He found Reyes pinned down near the east stairwell, blood soaking through his shoulder, two of Marco's men advancing behind cover. Vincent dropped both of them without breaking stride, hauled Reyes upright by the collar, and kept moving. "Where's Marco taking them?" "Foyer," Reyes gasped. "He said he wanted Moreau to watch." The foyer, when Vincent reached it, was already a battlefield. Glass and blood and the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging thick in the air where marble had once gleamed under chandelier light. Clara stood pressed against the base of the grand staircase. Eli held tight against her free hand, moving rapidly of his pressing patterns into his palm, guiding him through a world he couldn't see or hear, keeping him calm through instinct and love alone while chaos exploded around them. Marco stood 20 feet away, weapon raised, waiting. "There he is." Marco's voice carried across the ruined room, almost conversational despite the violence still echoing through the halls behind him. "Come to watch your empire burn one more time, Vincent. Let them go, Marco. This is between us." It was never just between us. Marco's finger tightened on the trigger, aimed not at Vincent but at Clara and the boy behind her. "You made it about everyone the second you decided some lives mattered more than the ones you threw away." Vincent didn't hesitate. He fired first, catching Marco's shoulder, the shot spinning him sideways as his own round went wide, punching into the marble a foot from Clara's head. She screamed, curling herself fully around Eli, and Vincent closed the distance in 3 strides, driving Marco to the ground with the full weight of 2 decades of restraint finally breaking loose. They grappled across the shattered floor, glass biting into skin, Marco's gloved hands closing around Vincent's throat with a strength born of 3 years of buried rage. Vincent drove an elbow into his ribs, broke the grip, and they rolled apart. Both bleeding, both breathing hard, the gunfire outside beginning to thin as sirens finally rose in the distance. "Police," Reyes shouted from the doorway, blood-slicked and staggering. "They're 2 minutes out, sir. We need to move." Marco lunged for the fallen weapon between them. Vincent got there first, kicked it clear across the marble, and in the half-second Marco spent scrambling after it. One of his own men, a young soldier who'd only ever known loyalty to Vincent, whose brother Marco had personally recruited into this betrayal, turned his weapon on his former captain instead, ending it before Vincent had to. Marco hit the floor and didn't move again. For a moment, the foyer held nothing but smoke and silence, and the distant wail of sirens closing in. Vincent turned. Clara was still on the ground, Eli wrapped fully in her arms, both of them trembling, alive, unharmed. Vincent crossed the room slowly, his weapon lowered, blood dripping from a cut along his jaw, and knelt in front of them without a word. Eli, sensing the new presence, went rigid, his hand instinctively reaching for the scent he'd learned to trust, the particular note of cologne that had, somewhere in the last week, stopped meaning danger and started meaning safety. His fingers found Vincent's sleeve. Vincent reached into his jacket and drew out something he'd had one of his men retrieve hours earlier in the brief window before the siege began. A replacement white cane, the boy's own having been lost somewhere in the chaos of their abduction. He pressed it gently into Eli's open hands. "I'm sorry," Vincent said quietly, his voice rough in a way none of his men had ever heard. "For all of it. For the guns pointed at you. For the fear I put in this house before I understood what was standing in front of me." Ellie's fingers closed around the cane, familiar and solid, and something in his small shoulders eased for the first time in hours. He didn't understand the words, couldn't hear them, couldn't see the face that spoke them, but he felt the tremor in Vincent's hand as he placed the cane there, felt the same trembling gentleness his mother used when the world had frightened him too badly for words to help. Pup. It was small, uncertain, still shadowed by exhaustion and fear, but it was real, and it broke something loose in Vincent Moreau that 20 years of violence had never managed to touch. He felt his throat close, felt his eyes burn in a way he hadn't allowed since the night his sister died, and for one unguarded moment in the wreckage of everything he'd built, he simply knelt there and let himself feel it. Clara watched him, something shifting behind her own eyes. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the beginning of something she hadn't expected to find in this house. Reyes appeared in the doorway again, breathless. "Sir, we recovered the chip from Marco's men. The backup's intact. Everything. The ledger, the accounts, all of it. The Empire survives." Vincent rose slowly to his feet, looking down at the small drive and Reyes's outstretched palm. 18 months of fear, betrayal, and bloodshed distilled into a fragment smaller than a fingernail. Everything he'd built, everything he'd milked, everything he'd nearly lost, everything he could rebuild right now with a single word. Sirens filled the driveway outside, blue and red lights spilling through the shattered windows across the marble floor. Vincent looked at the chip for a long moment, then at Clara, still holding her son, then at Eli, gripping his new cane with both hands, smiling toward a voice he'd never once heard and trusted completely anyway. "Reyes," he said quietly, "get me a secure line to the U.S. Attorney's office." Reyes blinked. "Sir?" Vincent's eyes didn't leave the boy. "I'm done rebuilding this." Reyes stared at him across the ruined foyer, the sirens outside growing louder, and for a moment Vincent thought his most loyal captain might actually argue. "Sir, with respect, you have the backup. Everything's recoverable. We could weather this. Rebuild stronger than before. You've done it once already." "I know." Vincent's voice was steady, quieter than Reyes had ever heard it. "That's exactly the problem." He looked down at Clara, still kneeling on the marble with Eli held close. The boy's small hand wrapped around the cane Vincent had placed there minutes earlier. He thought of 18 months of walking through his own house like a fortress commander, trusting no one, loving no one, building higher walls around an emptiness he'd stopped noticing years ago. He thought of Marco's voice, cracked open with old grief. I watched him forget the men who made it possible. He hadn't forgotten Marco's brother out of cruelty. He'd forgotten him because forgetting was the only way the Empire kept running, because somewhere along the way, he'd stopped counting the cost of what he built in the currency of actual people. An 8-year-old boy who couldn't see a single wall of this house had shown him more of it in a week than 20 years of building had ever let him see for himself. "Get me that line, Reyes." McCall took 4 minutes. The federal agents took 2 hours to arrive at the paperwork. What followed took months. Vincent Moreau's testimony dismantled an empire more thoroughly than any rival family or federal task force ever could have. He handed over the recovered ledger in its entirety. 11 judges, 3 senators, a police commissioner, 4 offshore banks, 2 cartel partnerships he'd inherited rather than built, and every safe house, every account, every buried transaction that had kept his organization untouchable for 2 decades. He testified for 6 weeks straight. He names he'd spent years protecting. He watched, without regret, as the empire he'd inherited from his father collapsed under the weight of its own history. In exchange, he asked for exactly one thing: immunity, not for himself, but for Clara and Eli Bennett, whose only crime had been surviving a morning they never should have been part of. The federal prosecutor granted it without hesitation. Clara wept the day the paperwork was finalized. Not from relief alone, but from the strange, disorienting weight of finally being free of a fear she'd carried since the first gunshot in that foyer. She held Eli against her that night in a hotel room paid for by the Federal Witness Program and whispered into his hair the only promise she had left to make. "We're safe now. We're really safe." 1 year later, the morning sun spilled gold across a garden in upstate New York, catching on wind chimes strung between young maple trees and the soft rustle of lavender planted along winding gravel paths designed to be felt underfoot as easily as seen. The Eli Bennett Center sat at the end of that garden, a converted farmhouse turned school, its walls lined with braille signage and tactile maps, its classrooms filled with the quiet, purposeful sound of children learning to navigate a world that had once seemed determined to shut them out. Mobility training, independence skills, tactile communication, taught the way Clara herself had once learned it, hand over hand, patience over pity. Clara stood on the porch, watching a new class of 6-year-olds cross the lawn with their canes, and allowed herself, as she did most mornings now, a moment of quiet disbelief. She hadn't worn a maid's uniform in a year. She hadn't apologized for existing in someone else's house in a year. She owned this place. Every board, every window, every square foot of ground her son now crossed without fear. Eli was 14 feet away, kneeling in the grass beside a smaller boy who couldn't have been older than 6, guiding the child's hands over the raised petals of a sensory garden bed planted specifically for mornings like this one. His own cane rested against his shoulder, forgotten for the moment, his laughter carrying clear and unguarded across the lawn as the younger boy discovered, for the first time, the particular velvet texture of a lamb's ear leaf. "Like this," Eli said, guiding the boy's fingers gently. "You feel that? Soft, right? Now find the rough one next to it." Clara watched her son, 9 years old now, taller, steadier, utterly unafraid, and felt the same ache of pride she felt every single morning. A man stood near the garden's far gate, dressed plainly, unremarkably, the kind of face that belonged to no one in particular. Only Clara recognized the set of his shoulders, the quiet stillness that had once filled an entire mansion with fear, and now simply watched, unnoticed, from a distance. She crossed the lawn toward him without hurry. "You weren't supposed to come in person," she said quietly once she reached him. "That's not how this arrangement works." "I know." Vincent's eyes didn't leave Eli. "I wanted to see it. Just once. The donations arrive every quarter. Anonymous, like always. Nobody asks questions." Clara studied him. Thinner than he'd been a year ago, dressed like any other man on any other street. No longer the kind of presence that reorganized a room the moment he entered it. "I never told anyone who it was." "I know that too." They stood together in silence for a moment, watching Eli laugh as the younger boy found the rough leaf and declared it his favorite. "Thank you," Clara said finally. "Not for the money. I'd have built this without it eventually." She turned to face him fully. "Thank you for choosing this. For choosing him, when it would have been so much easier to choose the Empire instead." Vincent was quiet for a long moment, his eyes still on the boy who had once, accidentally, unmade his entire life. "That phone didn't destroy anything that mattered," he said finally. "It saved me from an emptiness I'd stopped noticing. I built something enormous, Clara, and none of it made me feel the way I feel standing at this gate, watching him teach another child to feel the difference between soft and rough." He shook his head slowly. "I didn't lose an empire that day. I found the first honest thing I'd done in 20 years. Clara said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Vincent turned to leave, the way he always did, quietly, unannounced, back toward life smaller and quieter than the one he'd left behind, but somehow, impossibly, more his own. Eli's head lifted suddenly. He rose from the grass cane, finding his hand without needing to look, and crossed the lawn with unerring certainty toward the gate, drawn by a scent he'd know anywhere, a rhythm of footsteps his hands had learned to trust in the middle of the worst week of his life. He reached out, and his fingers found Vincent's hand. He smiled. Vincent knelt, just briefly, and let the boy's fingers rest against his own. No words needed, none possible, none necessary. Then he rose and walked away, carrying with him the quiet certainty that for the first time in his life he would be remembered by someone not as a man to be feared, but as a man who had knelt on a marble floor once and chosen mercy. Clara watched him go until he disappeared past the tree line, then turned back toward the garden, toward the sound of children's laughter drifting across the grass, toward the son who had once been called fragile by a world that never understood him. One accidental moment on a marble floor had shattered far more than a phone. It had shattered fear, exposed corruption, and given 3 broken lives a chance to begin again. Sometimes the smallest accident becomes the greatest miracle. A child who could neither see nor hear the world had become the reason a man finally opened his eyes to it.